Hi there. Um, Today we're gonna be talking about slavery in Islam, and basically I've already written down on this topic, and I'm just gonna be reading that out and explaining all the information that I'm gonna be reading out. I'm gonna talk about two things: how our Prophet treated slaves and told us to treat them, and also did he fail to abolish slavery. So I'm gonna start off by saying that slavery was widespread before Islam came to Arabia, and by abolishing it immediately, it would have caused the people to erect violently and caused conflict. So that's why it was abolished gradually. Like when something is common among people, you don't just come up and try to stop them. Like if one person try to stop them, then everyone's gonna think that he's mad. The same case was with our Prophet. He couldn't have stopped them immediately. Like, for example, even drinking wine wasn't abolished all of a sudden, since some of the companions and followers of the Prophet used to drink wine back then. And our Prophet didn't, like, just force them to stop drinking wine. He gradually, yeah, stopped the people from drinking alcohol. And some would even worship God and idols at the same time while worshipping Allah, including the uncle of our Prophet who worshipped idols. So yeah, the thing I'm trying to say is that you don't just stop people from doing something commonly practiced all of a sudden, even though it's wrong. You slowly make them understand it's wrong and then stop them from doing it. Otherwise, people will mock you for speaking out against a common practice. Yeah, especially since slavery was commonly practiced and widespread in Arabia even before Islam came. And some people, yeah, they don't know that slavery was it didn't come after Islam. It was already present before Islam came. So yeah, how our Prophet treated slaves and taught us to treat them. That's the first part. And yeah, we're gonna be discussing that. Look what the Prophet said about slaves. Feed them with the food which you eat, clothe them with such clothing as you wear, and do not cause harm to Allah's creatures. So if we're eating good food, we're told to feed our slaves with the same food. If we're wearing expensive clothes, branded clothes or whatever, we need to clothe the slaves with the same clothing. And yeah, do not be unkind to them, do not harm them, or um, yeah, just be kind to them. That's what our Prophet said. And now let's see what the Quran says. Quran chapter 19 verse 11 to 14 states that a society cannot progress unless slaves are freed. So here's the verse. And we showed him two ascending paths of nobility, but he did not follow the path of Aqaba. And what should make you know what the Aqaba is? It is the freeing of a slave. So I believe what this verse means is, I guess God probably showed someone two ascending paths to nobility, and one of them was Aqaba. I guess that's an Arabic word which means freeing of a slave, and he did not follow that path. So, yeah. Also, the Prophet gave laws to ensure that slaves were to start with taken as human beings who had feelings, emotions, and other humanly desires that needed to be looked after. Here's another example of how the Prophet taught to be kind to slaves or else you'll get punished. So there's this guy who reported to have said that he was angry at one of his slaves and physically disciplined him. And our Prophet approached him and said, do not forget that there is a God above you who has more power over you than you have over his slave. The guy was terrified by this reminder and the presence of the Prophet, um, and immediately announced that he had freed that slave. And our Prophet endorsing the sect said, Had you not done so, you would have burnt in the fire of hell." So basically, this guy, he, as I've said before, do not be unkind to slaves. That's what our prophet said. And he had been unkind to his slave. He hurt him, tried to physically discipline him, or probably did. Yeah, he probably did. So our prophets saw that and um, told him that God has more power over you than you have over his slave. He was terrified by this reminder. He freed the slave, and our prophet went on to say that if you hadn't done so, you would have ended in the fire of hell. So yeah, you can clearly see the freeing of a slave is given a lot of importance in our religion. Like our prophet tried his best to somehow, I mean, slavery, since it was a common practice, it was not even only present in Arabia, even outside Arabia. So I mean, what he tried back then, it wasn't really possible to totally finish slavery and eliminate it. So he basically tried his best to encourage the freeing of slaves. You can clearly see it from yeah, the above example. Other than that, the Quran even encouraged marriage between the slaves and their masters, so no difference remains between them and all are treated equally. Like imagine if this happened in the West, um, this a slave marrying his master or her master. So yeah, also freeing of a slave is even considered important to forgive our sins. And an example of this is basically for breaking fast by having sexual intercourse with it during Ramadan, only when you're fasting. Ramadan is basically when a month of fasting. So if you break your fast by yeah doing that stuff, yeah, the consequences are free a slave, and if that is not possible, fast for 2 consecutive moon months, and if that's not possible, feed or clothe 60 people in need. So yeah, if you do that crazy stuff during the fasting month, the holy month of Ramadan, you need to free a slave. If you can't do that, fast for 2 consecutive moon months. That's 2 months of fasting. That's mad. And if you still can't do that, then feed or clothe 60 people, 60 poor or needy people. Also, it's clear how our Prophet first tried to slowly change the perception that slaves are inferior and taught to treat them like you would treat your family. One notable example is Bilal, who was a black man and a slave, and has been promised by our Prophet to be the first to enter heaven on a horse alongside our Prophet. So basically, the first guy who's gonna enter heaven along with our Prophet is gonna be a black man who was a slave. And this is like such a. I believe our Prophet basically ended slavery. You can't say that he didn't. And I mean, it didn't end because um, it was widespread. But yeah, our religion, it clearly it does not encourage slavery. It encourages the freeing of slaves. So yeah, this equality is indicated in Quran 4:25, which addresses free people and slaves as the one of you is as the other. So you can see the equality over here. And in Quran 39:95 refers to master and slave with the same word. Like imagine master and slave as the same word. Like there is no difference between a master and a slave in our religion. The Quran recognizes slavery as a source of injustice as it places the freeing of slaves on the same level as feeding the poor. Also, the Quran permits owners to take slaves and as concubines, though it promotes abstinence as the better choice. I mean, right now, well, I'll talk about this later. It strictly prohibits slave prostitution. But the reason it permitted taking slaves as concubines is because back then, during wars, the men would die, and this way you'd give protection to the women and would protect them from indulging in evil deeds such as prostitution. But only in case of war were they to take the women and offer them protection. So yeah, this concubine thing, it's basically um, it's been abolished basically. But back then, during wars, most of the men would die. The women would um, they wouldn't have no home, and there would be no guardian and stuff. So they'd indulge in illegal practices just to make a living, and because of that, yeah, people could take them as concubines and take care of them. But yeah, the concubine thing is now abolished. You can't have concubines. Islamic kingdoms later on, like the Ottoman Empire, indulged in slave trade, including selling concubines. It wasn't because of religion, it was because of economic reasons. It was a business back then. Also, I wouldn't say Muslims are angels. I mean, we've made mistakes, every human makes mistakes, but I believe that this was a this was probably a sin because since slave trade it encouraged slavery rather than end it, which is clearly against our religion. So what the Islamic kingdoms did was wrong. And also, slavery was never endorsed by Islamic texts, rather it was something inherited from pre-Islamic cultures, and I'm talking about pre-600s, that needed to be voluntarily and gradually weeded out of society through freeing of slaves, which our Prophet highly encouraged. Uh, Also, it's difficult to find any references on how to make slaves out of people. Rather, the focus is always on ending slavery. Also, references in Islamic texts about slavery don't apply any longer for modern age, given that slavery has been officially banned internationally since 1948, and there is a widespread consensus across all nations on this, including Muslim ones. Um, yeah, there was a clear agenda in key Islamic texts to eventually eradicate slavery, so now it's gone. There's no need to bring it back, and I believe it'd be a sin to bring it back on purpose when in Islam and our Prophet have clearly discouraged it by encouraging their freedom and by working hard on trying to eradicate it from the society. So yeah, it's just gonna be a sin to bring it back. Also, now the other question is, did the Prophet fail to abolish slavery? So the thing is, the majority of the slaves back in those days were a product of wars and conflicts, where the prisoners of war were taken as slaves. But our religion has told us to be kind to the prisoners and treat them with respect. Also, it was not practical that the enemies make Muslim prisoners slaves, but the Muslims release the enemy prisoners. Therefore, taking prisoners as slaves only made sense if the enemy did it too. And yeah, slavery has nothing to do with any Quranic laws, though, but instead with the principle of reciprocity. Reciprocity. Quran doesn't even provide an option to make prisoners of war slaves. So this is what the Quran says about prisoners of war, and either confer favor afterwards or ransom them until the war lays down its burdens. So basically, either Muslims free them or take something in return for release. But the option of slavery does not even exist. This proves that slavery during our Prophet's time existed only due to it being widespread and common since pre-Islamic times, and not because of Islam encouraging it. Rather, Islam discouraged it. Also, yeah, some people say that our Prophet failed to abolish slavery because it thrived under Islamic kingdoms, and that the Europeans abolished it later on. So what I'm gonna say about this is that our Prophet's job wasn't to make sure slavery isn't practiced. His job was to only spread the word of God, like all other prophets. If the Islamic kingdoms practiced slavery after a prophet abolished it, then that can't be blamed on our prophet. He's done his job. It is our job whether we listen to him or not. It's basically the same as people committing sins which are forbidden. You can't say that this person drank alcohol, so Muhammad failed to stop us from drinking it. No, he was just a warner, and it is our deeds and whether we choose to follow him or not which will get us to heaven. So saying that he failed wouldn't make sense. He just came to give us a message, encourage us to free slaves, discourage slavery, and if we still enslave people, then that's our problem, not his. Yeah, but even then, in the Islamic kingdoms, slaves played various social and economic roles, from domestic worker to highest ranking positions in the government, like Sultan. Um, yeah, slaves have created some great empires in history, including the Ghaznavid Empire, Khwarezmiya Empire, Delhi Sultanate, Mamluk Sultanate of Iraq, and Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt and Levant. Also, I think Saladin was also a slave, I'm not sure. I think I've heard that he was a slave too. One of the greatest generals who fought the Crusades, yeah. Other than moreover, slaves were widely employed in irrigation, mining, pastoralism, and the army. Some rulers even relied on military and administrative slaves to such a degree that they were considered above from the general public, and sometimes they seized power. And how modern slavery is still present in Europe, even though you say Europe abolished it. Uh, on any given day in 2016, an estimated 3.6 million men, women, and children were living in modern slavery in Europe and Central Asia. This region had a prevalence of 3.9 people in modern slavery for every 1,000 people in the region. So should I say that Europe failed to abolish slavery? It's way worse in America, even though they had to go through a civil war because of slavery. Also, you cannot ignore the fact that the Europeans and Americans, how they treated the slaves. So basically, slaves were punished by whipping, shackling, hanging, beating, burning, mutilation, branding, rape, and imprisonment. And sometimes abuse was performed to reassert the dominance of the master over the slave. I compare this with what our Prophet taught, and the people complaining about Islamic slavery and all that. Um, yeah, what can I say? Yeah, if Islamic kingdoms they practiced slavery, encouraged slave trade, then they did wrong. Did the same thing that the Europeans did, and that was basically to help their economies. It has nothing to do with our religion. You clearly see that it's a sin in our religion. But yeah, what the Europeans did was way worse. And the violence, brutality, and human rights violations, especially against blacks, the racism they had to go through, the effects of which are still felt to this day through racial slurs and racist incidents. Also, the way the West took control of Africa and India's resources and stole their wealth, carved out a map dividing the Middle East and spreading the idea of nationalism to divide the Muslims, also sowing a seed of hatred by illegally giving away Palestine and by creating the Kashmir issue, which remains unsolved till this day. Anytime there will be a nuclear war and millions will die. So yeah, people must not be proud of the fact that Europe ended slavery. It doesn't matter if they ended it and decolonized after reaping all the benefits and sucking the blood of other nations, which was the main goal. So to steal their resources, and they achieved that. They stopped slavery after they got what they wanted. European history isn't something to be proud of, but let's not talk about politics. I wrote this because someone mentioned Europe abolishing slavery. Where the West is still struggling to fight racism, but our prophet had ended it almost 1,000 years ago. All mankind, this is basically what our prophet said, all mankind is from Adam and Eve. An Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab, nor a non-Arab has any superiority over an Arab. Also, white has no superiority over a black, nor a black has any superiority over a white, except by piety and good action. This is basically the last sermon of our prophet, and it also clarifies the fact that some people say that our prophet was a white man with black slaves. First of all, our prophet wasn't white. He was a fair person, but wasn't white. And I mean, I've already mentioned the thing about him, um, about the Bilal thing. The guy, black man, who was a slave, and he's gonna be the first person to enter heaven alongside our prophet. And also, our prophet's stepmother was a black woman, and he was not racist, and he's basically ended racism in his last sermon. White has no superiority over black, nor a black has any superiority over a white. And the message our religion gave basically tells us to abolish slavery. So yeah, it did abolish it, but the leaders later on turned it into a business for economic gains. Also, Europe fully abolished slavery in 1834. It doesn't matter if some Muslim countries abolished it a century later. I don't see a century as too much of a difference. Like, Europe abolished it fully in 1834. I guess a few Muslim countries they abolished it in the 20th century, early 20th or mid 20th century, 19 I'm not sure 1940s or 50s or something. Anyway, the thing is that everyone benefited from the slave trade. Only difference is that the Muslim leaders were going against Islam by encouraging it. It has nothing to do with our prophet. It was our own mistake. Again, I'm gonna say that we're not angels, so of course, yeah, we made mistakes, and yeah, the leaders are they're gonna be answerable to God for the slave trade and all that. Also, most at the end, I would just want to say that most interpretations of the Quran agree that the Quran envisions an ideal society as one in which slavery no longer exists. So yeah, that's basically it. I guess I'll end the video. Also, uh, yeah, the I recently went to a museum, and it was the museum basically had these idols dated back to about, I don't know, 1000 BC or something. Pagans used to worship them, and they had like these holes engraved into their heads. And the guy who took care of the museum, he told me that uh, there were diamonds placed in their heads. But when the British left India, they took those diamonds, and one of the idols still had one diamond in on his head. What I'm trying to say is that the British even took all the diamonds and stuff. They totally looted India's economy. It was one of the biggest economies back then. So yeah, do not be proud of European history. Sucks. Also, I believe I've cleared the slavery thing. If there's still any doubt or a question you may ask, I'll try to clear that out. Yeah, I'll be ending the video now. Bye.